Yeah, I'll react to that. Sure.
Yeah, all right, I accept the dare.
Tried to
I accept the dare. Doing it.
Scientists have tried to conquer the mind through many different ways for many different reasons. One such is in the treatment of mental disorders. Experimental science has, in some of its most controversial studies, shed a light into how the brain works.
Guys, sorry. So this is plainly difficult. The dark side of science, the lobotomy, the worst surgery in history. So, isn't there evidence? Jesus, I just had like a stroke. Evidence of a lot of successful, whether you want to call them lobotomies or not, at least skull removal surgeries. Like I'm talking way back, like even in like Stone Age times too, and more of people having clear like as surgically as they could with the tools they had, removal of the skull, and then showed healing to show that they actually lived through the procedure. I don't know if that's what this is about, but
We've seen
because a lobotomy is like you're taking out brain matter.
this in
right?
these studies shed a light into how the brain works. We've seen this in this very series with the monkey mother, baby Albert, and Milgram experiments. But how about the treatment of mental disorders in a world before modern-day medicinal drug-based therapy? Around the mid-20th century, a form of invasive surgical procedure would gain praise for being able to tackle the problem of overcrowded mental hospitals and treat the previously untreatable.
Just like
It
kill
would
them.
eventually be known as the lobotomy. The surgery would go down in the annals of time as a barbaric and cruel procedure.
That wasn't a
which would leave
suggestion.
behind-
That was a kind of a macabre joke. Sorry.
Go down in the annals of time as a barbaric and cruel procedure, which would leave behind thousands of patients in its wake with devastating side effects including confusion, incontinence, seizures, and in some cases even death. One of the main characters in the story of this surgical procedure would describe the operation as surgically induced childhood. Eventually the surgery would become synonymous with the mishandling of mental health and the running roughshod over patients' rights.
Surgically
As such,
induced
I'm going to rate this
childhood?
dark page in scientific history a 9 on my plain difficult ethical scale. Welcome
Really?
to the dark side of science.
We've done some messed up stuff, haven't we? This is a 9.
It is the turn of the 20th century. Mental health institutions throughout Europe and the USA have become dangerously overcrowded. During the 19th century, where scientific discovery took leaps and bounds, many attempts to treat the mentally ill had failed, leading to a large population of incurable patients. This was due to many industrialised countries having national systems of regulated asylums. These institutions sought out care for patients that had been disposed of in the system by their families, poor houses, and the criminal justice system. With no proper ways of treating inhabitants of the asylums, many different forms of medical procedure were tested on the unfortunate patients. There are many gruesome types of treatment on offer in the early 20th century. In 1917, malaria therapy was introduced, where a patient would be deliberately infected with the zoonotic disease to induce fever to fight neurosyphilis. In 1920, the barbiturate-induced deep sleep
Neurosyphilis. Syphilis seems to be a terrifying disease. I'm so glad that is not as big of a deal anymore. I'm sure it is in certain parts of the world.
therapy for premature dementia, aka precocious madness, or in its modern name form, schizophrenia. This treatment used drugs to keep patients unconscious for days or even weeks. In 1927, you might have been given insulin shock treatment, which used the peptide hormone to induce daily comas. In 1934, patients could be prescribed with the first type of seizure therapy, where a patient would be deliberately induced into convulsions by the use of PTZ. This therapy would be superseded by the more familiar electroshock therapy. Although these treatments could cause long-term lasting psychological and physical trauma, The patient had not undergone a surgical procedure to eradicate the disorder. But in 1935, in Portugal, a doctor named Antonio Moniz would change this when he performed the first leucotomy on a patient.
So especially with like the old-timey footage, it's really easy for us to like be kind of horrified by it, which we should sometimes, but I think it's important to like step back and rather than judge individuals like the doctors back then, which we can do, you know, I'm not saying you can't do, but just as like a growing experience for humanity, that this is a chapter of trying to alleviate a lot of mental issues. And so it is quite sad in a lot of ways, but they didn't really know better. And so that's how I like to look at things when learning is like, this is what humans did back then. We, if we were back then, would be probably struggling with the same concept. So that's how I like to learn about stuff, right? Not less judgmentally and more just curious, you know?
The leucotomy in its most basic form
Does that make sense?
was the deliberate damage of brain tissue in order to treat mental illness. The name would later be changed to a more recognisable name when the procedure spread across the Atlantic Ocean, but that will come later on in our story. The thinking that inspired Moniz was that mental illnesses originated from abnormal neural connections in the frontal lobe. Moniz had seen the after effects of soldiers who had received injuries to the front lobe, in which the veterans would show a calm and quiet disposition. The brain is made up of two types of matter, grey and white. Grey matter is the brain's neurons and associated blood vessels and extensions. The white matter is the nerve fibres that are connected to the areas of grey matter and carry messages between them through electrical impulses.
Wait. Did I catch that right? So because they saw people who had suffered frontal brain injuries in World War II, because they saw that they would kind of be sedated or like that had like a calming effect. Therefore, we should do that to patients to have the same effect. That's pretty crazy, if that's true.
Into the areas of grey matter and carry messages between them through electrical impulses. Moniz theorised that by severing the white matter fibres from the frontal lobe would improve the patient's mental illness. Although in theory this might make sense, the connections within the brain in reality are far more complex than what was thought at the time.
I'm sorry. What? So again, I try to not be like hindsight, like Captain Hindsight over here, being like, oh, you're so stupid. Like very smart people back then who became doctors. But how much do you have to think that like just because you have a few surviving war veterans who have damage to their front brain and are appearing more calm, therefore there probably won't, the brain probably isn't at this insanely complex thing. It's just like, this happens there, therefore let's just like, you know, sever some stuff in the front of the person's brain and see if it happens. That's nuts.
The grim procedure.
It seems like other stuff can, there are side effects.
In reality are far more complex than what was thought at the time. The grim procedure in its first form would involve drilling holes in the skull either side of the prefrontal cortex and injecting the connecting fibres with alcohol to destroy them. Moniz found this method to not yield very good results due to the solution damaging much more than the white matter.
Yeah.
A tool
Jesus. So either I'm not getting something.
was developed called a leucotome, which looked like a long stick with a retractable wire loop inside. It allowed the operator to insert a metal loop into the brain, which was used to sever the white matter by extending and then retracting said loop. The process cut 6 cores in the white matter of each hemisphere using the new tool. Because the procedure involved cutting through the skull, the patient had to be operated on in a proper operating theatre under general anaesthetic. To test the theory, Moniz enlisted neurosurgeon Almeida Lima to conduct the surgery on 20 test subjects. Of these initial 20 patients who were suffering from depression, schizophrenia, and anxiety, Moniz claimed 7 cures, 7 improvements, and 6 unchanged cases, although the results were open to interpretation. Moniz claimed that the risk of some behavioural and personality deterioration outweighed the debilitating effects of severe psychiatric illness, which is understandable when taking mental health care at the time as a contextual background. A second set of patients were operated on due to the success of the first trial. These 18 patients all suffered from schizophrenia, and 3 were considered as almost cured, and another 2 had also become improved.
The other 13?
Moniz did conclude that patients that had deteriorated considerably from their condition pre-procedure did not benefit much from the operation. In a well-known quote from Moniz, he described his radical new surgery. Prefrontal leucotomy is a simple operation, always safe, which may prove to be an effective surgical treatment in certain cases of mental disorder. The procedure would eventually earn Moniz a Nobel Prize in 1949. But initially, Moniz's new way of treating the thought to be untreatable was widely derided by the medical community. In 1936, Moniz published his results through articles in the medical press and a monograph, but to little attention. On the 26th of July 1936, one of his assistants gave a presentation at the Parisian meeting of the Société Médico-Psychologique on the results of the second test subjects, the 18 people suffering from schizophrenia leucotomized by Lima. This meeting wouldn't go down well, as the lead doctor at the institute in Lisbon, who had supplied the first set of patients to Moniz, was also in attendance and widely denounced the after-effects of the surgery, saying that patients who had returned to his institute post-operation were diminished and had suffered a degradation of personality.
Okay, now I'm just confused. I'm ticking away the things like it's not like scientists weren't scientific in that, like, okay, like this seems like such a simple thing to be able to like look at the criteria, and the fact that they said no effects, right, or sorry, no risk is one of the things they said. That's insane. And the fact that that they were like, what is going on in this person's head? Not the patient, the doctor, in that he's this confident. Like he's either insane or he cares more about his image than whether or not his procedure helps anyone or hurts anyone.
Further adding that the initial results of calmness and improvement were more likely attributed to the severe shock of the surgery and ultimately from the horrible brain trauma that the procedure induced on its victims. Many other
This is like someone's like being like really crazy and stuff. Oh, well, I had this new technique called smash him in the head with a shovel, okay? And 10 out of 10 of my subjects all stopped being crazy. They all kind of went to sleep and still haven't woke up and are starting to smell pretty bad, but success. They're not crazy anymore.
Physicians denounced the procedure, but bizarrely, this isn't the end, as several individual clinicians thought Moniz's leucotomy could be useful on an experimental basis on severe patients. And as such, the surgery was spread throughout Europe and even to the US.
I'm sorry, this is my last thing. This is what it feels like. It feels like some crazy doctors who just want to mess around with people's brains just to like see what happens, who don't care at all and are just getting people who are there like, whatever. You know, they're already insane and are just like having fun. Like that's the vibe I'm getting.
1930s.
It's
and
kind
this leads us down an even darker path. It is here that we are introduced to American doctors Walter Freeman and James W. Watts. Inspired by Moniz's new surgical procedure in 1936, the duo performed their own leucotomy. Walter had learned of the procedure after a chance meeting of Moniz at the London-hosted Second International Congress of Neurology in 1935. The American was fascinated by the surgical technique, Upon returning to the US, Freeman started communicating with the Portuguese doctor. Moniz, during the correspondence, promised to send a monograph on leucotomy and urged him to purchase a leucotome of his own. Upon receiving the paper on the procedure, Freeman reviewed it and set about with his colleague Watts on experimenting with the surgery, which led to September 1936. Seeing flaws in the surgery, Watts and Freeman developed their own variation, which renamed the procedure the standard prefrontal lobotomy, to differentiate it from the Moniz method. This version severed more of the white matter and would be the de facto method moving forward for lobotomies performed in operating theatres. Walter thought that the lobotomy could be streamlined even further still. The new standard procedure had the same shortcoming of the Moniz method, and that was access to the brain. You see, cutting through the patient's skull required the operation to be conducted in an operating theatre with all the traffic.
Guys, the guy who had a bunch of the patients and said, like, there's no risk, like, it's just out of 18 patients, 4 improved a lot, 4 improved a little, and 10 didn't have any change. Well, if there's no risk, then how about you go through it and you do, and we'll have a lobotomy on you. And the worst that happens is, you know, nothing happens.
Trappings, anesthesiologist, qualified surgeon, hygiene, and so on and so forth. Walter had heard of an Italian doctor, Amarello Fiamberti, who had performed the leucotomy by accessing the prefrontal lobe through the eye socket in 1937. Fiamberti's method was to puncture the thin layer of orbital bone at the top of the eye socket, and then, much like Moniz's early experiments, inject alcohol into the white matter, or in later surgery,
This is some Jeffrey
cutting the white
Dahmers.
matter with a hypodermic needle. Walter took this process and modified it using probably one of the most unlikely of tools.
Pretty
This is
certain Jeffrey Dahmer did that, like, in order to, like, because he wanted to preserve his victims, right? And he'd, like, drill a hole in their head and put acid in it to try and make them like a zombie state. I'm getting major, like, let's just remove this part of the brain on someone who doesn't matter and see the effect sort of vibes.
a surgical tool. Or is this a surgical tool? It's hard to tell, as one was used in psychosurgery and the other is
Chisel?
an ice pick.
Yeah.
But the similarity is not a coincidence, as Freeman's improvements on Amarello Fiamberti's transorbital lobotomy replaced the needle with an ice pick. In development of this new method, Freeman took an ice pick from his own kitchen and started practicing on a watermelon. He would eventually graduate to using cadavers. The thinking was that if the lobotomy could be performed without exposing the brain, then it could be performed by psychiatrists in psychiatric hospitals, allowing more people to be operated on. These are the tools used to the Freeman transorbital lobotomy. A new tool called the orbiter clasp, essentially an ice pick with markings along the side, and a hammer. The method would involve the patient being either under anaesthetic or electroconvulsive therapy used to render the subject unconscious. Then the orbiter clasp sharp end is placed under the eyelid and against the top of the eye socket. The hammer is then used to penetrate the surgical instrument through the thin layer of bone and into the brain along the line of the bridge of the nose, eventually going 5 centimeters deep. The orbiter clasp was then pivoted 40 degrees at the orbital perforation, so the tip cut towards the opposite side of the head. After this, the tool was then hammered in a further 2 centimeters into the brain.
And redone.
Again, the orbiter clasp was pivoted around 28 degrees each side to cut outwards and again inwards. Once this was complete, it was removed and the process was repeated on the other eye socket. The first patient to receive the procedure was in 1946.
How'd they do?
But once Freeman's partner Watts had heard about this new method, he left their practice, disgusted at the transorbital lobotomy. But like every other chapter in this story, this would not hamper the procedure's prevalence. The lobotomy had now been transformed from a serious surgical procedure of last resort to a 10-minute doctor's office job. Along with this came a severe lack of follow-up care and monitoring, which led to high relapse rates. Because of this, towards the end of the 1940s, nearly 20,000 people in the US had received the procedure. But not only that, but transorbital lobotomy would spread across the world and even back to the leucotomy's home grounds of Europe, spreading further still to the Soviet Union and Japan. To get a lobotomy in its late 1940s peak, you really didn't need to have much of a mental health condition, with the treatment touted for all kinds of ailments. The list of treatable illnesses with a lobotomy included, but was certainly not limited to, ADD, OCD, anxiety, PTSD, postnatal depression, chronic pain, Alzheimer's, criminality, and violent outbursts.
Well, I've got 2. Time to scramble it.
Freeman, ever the showman, was responsible for a patient's death in 1951 when pausing a lobotomy to pose for a photo, in doing so causing severe brain hemorrhaging.
Did he go to jail? I'm guessing not. I'm losing hope. I'm getting made, like, you know, like the Japanese scientists in World War II that would use Chinese civilians in weird, sick ways, like that had a scientific purpose in the end, right? But they just did not care at all about the person being tested on. I'm getting similar vibes.
He was even known to lobotomize 2 patients at the same time, one with each hand. The doctor even performed the operation on minors, including children as young as 4.
Okay.
In total, around 15% of patients who received a lobotomy died, but many more were changed for life, a shell of what they once were. For those who survived the ordeal, relapse would often follow. But like its first unveiling to the world in Paris in 1936, the procedure didn't go uncriticised. In the late 1940s, as Moniz was set to receive his Nobel Prize, multiple voices in the medical community spoke out.
Okay, this doesn't make sense to me. Surely the Nobel Prize is going to mean a ton of people. Like, this makes me think like the Nobel Prize is like, oh, here you go. Like, don't they care about data? Don't they want to see, especially something as insane as this is like curing mental illnesses with sticking this inside of your head? How does you even get close to even mentioning a Nobel Prize? I'm losing hope.
A barbaric procedure. But it wouldn't be the criticism for the December banning of the procedure in the USSR, but the synthesization of chlorpromazine, the first antipsychotic. As a side note, Soviet psychologist Dr. Nikolai Orozhevsky was quoted saying that lobotomies violate the principles of humanity, and that was from an official from 1950s USSR. The procedure gradually fell out of vogue, but Freeman would continue to perform the lobotomy all the way until 1967. When after their third lobotomy, one of Walter's patients died of a hemorrhage. This final procedure would get him banned from performing it ever again.
Oh my God, I'm shocked.
The USSR wouldn't be the last to ban lobotomies, as even Moniz's Portugal would disallow the procedure from use. With further developments in drugs such as
Britain.
SSRIs, antipsychotics, and types of therapy like CBT, the need for surgical intervention slowly faded away, and by the 1980s, lobotomy became a thing of the past. Now, how would you rate the lobotomy on my ethical scale? 1 being good and 9 being pure cruelty? Let me know in the comments.
Huh. I don't think it's a 9 because I feel like 9 in any of these scales, I think that the extremes of the scale should be almost never be used. Because this guy is not as evil as like a Nazi scientist or I'm just using World War II scientists as an example, or Japanese scientists who, I mean, were performing science with a horrendous disregard for any civilian. And these guys are kind of taking in, what am I saying? I don't even know. I don't know, an 8. A 9 would be like if he like ate it or something. I don't know. Like, you got to be sick to get a 9, all right? More sick than even this. But it feels like that early stage of trying to diagnose any problem where it's just like, well, just like the TV's broken. We'll just like smash it with your hand. Did that work? And if not, then diagnose. And it feels like that stage of just like, just stick it in there and jiggle it a bit, and maybe, who knows? Maybe it'll come out better. I don't know. Yeah. Jesus Christ. All right. Thanks, Mel. Very nice video. No, it was fascinating. As someone who suffers with mental issues myself, I think everyone kind of suffers with mental issues at some point or another. So I don't want to act like I'm like hurting as much as a lot of people are, but I do have some of my own mental problems, and I definitely like to learn about my own mental, whether anxiety, depression, ADD. And so I'm fascinated by this, but at the same time, kind of disappointed, I guess is the word. Of just, man, people really didn't care about other people that much. I mean, at least they're trying. A for effort. God. See you guys next time. Bye.